Hello, I'm Ros Atkins. This is BBC News live from Washington. On his first domestic trip as president, Donald Trump visits two states hit hard by disasters and says he may abolish the Federal Disaster Relief Agency. The US is freezing nearly all foreign aid, with exceptions only for emergency food and military funding for Israel and Egypt. And we'll be discussing some of the other executive orders that President Trump has signed this week, from January the 6th pardons to declaring a national emergency at the US-Mexico border. Hello, I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome to a special programme here on BBC News covering President Trump's first week in office. We're going to look at some of the most significant developments from the last few days, but we'll begin with what is happening today, because Donald Trump has been visiting hurricane-affected areas of North Carolina before then heading to Los Angeles, where he's visiting some of the areas worst affected by the wildfires there. 28 people lost their lives in the disaster. At least 12,000 homes and businesses were damaged. And already this week, the president suggested he may withhold federal disaster assistance for California unless the state changes its approach to water management. In North Carolina, Hurricane Helene killed more than 100 people in September. Speaking in Asheville, President Trump threatened to dismantle the U.S. Federal Emergency Agency, FEMA, saying it had turned out to be a disaster itself.
I'll also be signing an executive order to begin the process of fundamentally reforming and overhauling FEMA, or maybe getting rid of FEMA. I think, frankly, FEMA is not good. I think when you have a problem like this, I think you want to go and, whether it's a Democrat or Republican governor, you want to use your state to fix it and not waste time.
In Washington, the three most powerful politicians in America have spoken at what organizers claim is the largest anti-abortion rally in the world. Thousands of campaigners marched at the event. It was called the March for Life. It came after the president pardoned 23 anti-abortion activists who were convicted of blockading a reproductive health clinic and intimidating staff and patients. The Vice President, J.D. Vance, spoke to the crowd, telling them they were there to celebrate victories yet to come. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, also spoke, saying it's a new golden age for America, echoing Donald Trump's inauguration speech on Monday. And the president himself sent a video message from the White House. He promised to protect what he called the gains made in his first administration. That's a reference to the reversal of a nationwide right to an abortion.
Hello to everyone at the March for Life. It's a pleasure to speak to you from the beautiful Oval Office. That's where we are right now, the magnificent Oval Office. And thank you for turning out once again to show your extraordinary love and compassion for the unborn. On the first anniversary of the disastrous ruling known as Roe v. Wade, that unconstitutional decision took power away from the states and the voters, kicking off 50 years of division and anger.
Well, in the last hour, President Trump has taken actions to limit US government funding for abortions and other reproductive health care. He signed a memorandum to reinstate a policy which bans global health aid for foreign organisations that provide or promote abortions. He's also signed an executive order aimed at enforcing the Hyde Amendment, which has blocked the use of US government funds on abortions since 1977. Well, joining me to discuss this is Audrey Fahlberg, political reporter with the National Review. Audrey, thank you very much indeed for your time today. What's your analysis and response to these different decisions relating to abortion that the president has taken?
Well, first, I think it's really important to acknowledge that there was quite a bit of tension between President Donald Trump and pro-life advocates on the campaign trail. As you recall, on the campaign trail, he came out against a national abortion ban, which was seen as very controversial among pro-life advocates. So they were watching to see very closely. You know, he did appoint these Supreme Court justices who helped overturn Roe v. Wade. But would he help continue to give the pro-life movement wins while in office? And so, as you mentioned, those two executive orders that he signed aboard Air Force One earlier today are going to be seen as wins for the pro-life movement in terms of strengthening the Hyde Amendment, which, as you mentioned, bans federal funding for abortion, and a separate executive order which bans federal funding for NGOs, which help fund abortions. So pro-life activists are having a good day today. And of course, next week and into the weekend and into next week, expect to see a lot of resistance from Democrats on all of these moves here.
Audrey, just to put this in context, do these decisions today take us back to where we were during Donald Trump's first term? Do they reverse decisions taken by Joe Biden, or is he actually now going further than he did when first president?
A lot of these executive orders do reverse quite a few Biden executive orders on energy, on immigration. Of course, recall that when President Biden took office, he reversed a decision that Trump had made to leave the Paris Climate Accords, to leave the World Health Organization. So, of course, with a lot of these administrations and turnover, there's a lot of ping-ponging back and forth. But on immigration in particular, Donald Trump is taking it a little bit further. Of course, he did sign an executive order earlier this week, his first day in office, trying to overhaul birthright citizenship, which of course was immediately met with a lawsuit. So with a lot of these executive orders, expect to see quite a bit of litigation over the next few years.
Audrey, I must also ask you about these comments from the president about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Agency. Very, very strong words from Donald Trump, suggesting there may even be a case for scrapping the agency. What is that level of hostility towards FEMA based on?
This is going to cause a lot of a stir in Congress. Of course, not all Republican lawmakers are going to be behind this. It would probably require congressional approval for him to actually overhaul this agency. But I think, conversations about federal disaster aid, he said earlier today that he is supportive of conditioning federal disaster aid to California unless they sign voter ID laws. And recall, this kind of all comes against the backdrop of a very controversial debate in Washington that was already existing before he assumed the presidency earlier this week about whether to condition federal aid. Fiscal hawks have wanted to do this for several days now. So expect this to bleed into next week when Congress returns. Of course, the Senate is still in today, right now, about to move forward on Pete Hegseth's confirmation fight as well. So they're not done today.
Well, on that vote on Pete Hegseth, where are we with that? Are we expecting him to now be confirmed as Defense Secretary?
So for the past few weeks, he has been the most controversial of Donald Trump's cabinet picks. He has picked up a lot of momentum in the past couple of weeks, and he was seen as, still having a very narrow fight, but he was expected to get in. There's been quite a bit of suspense today on his fate, because yesterday Republicans did break a filibuster on his nomination, but notably Susan Collins on his nomination, but notably Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, two longtime moderate senators, voted against advancing his nomination. Now tonight, in the next hour, we're about to see kind of what happens here with this vote, but all eyes are on Mitch McConnell, the former Senate GOP leader, who has stayed very mum on Pete Hegseth's nomination. He did vote to advance his nomination last night, but he's been very, very quiet, as he always is on this nomination. Also, one more thing. Yesterday, Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, who's up for re-election in 2026, said that he wants to do more due diligence on some of the recent allegations that have been raised about him regarding drinking and sexual misconduct, which Pete Hegseth has denied, of course, which is important to point out here. Tom Tillis has said he wants to do additional due diligence before taking his vote. But the last thing here is that he can only afford 3 Republican defections. If that's the case, J.D. Vance, the vice president, would need to come break that tie. But Republicans are optimistic that he will get through later today.
Audrey, we appreciate you taking us through that. And of course, we're going to keep a very close eye on that vote in the coming minutes and hours. That's Audrey Falberg, political reporter with the National Review. And as we were speaking to Audrey, you can also see the live feed coming into us of Donald Trump speaking. We're, of course, listening across that, and we'll bring you some of what he says a little later here on BBC News. Well, we've talked about some of the decisions being taken by Donald Trump and his new administration in this first week. Next, let's turn to foreign policy. Of course, this policy falls under his broader America First approach, and we've been looking this week for signs of what that may mean in practice. Here's a little of what Donald Trump told world leaders and business executives during his first virtual address as president to the World Economic Forum in Davos.
My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply, you will have to pay a tariff. Under the Trump administration, there will be no better place on earth to create jobs, build factories, or grow a company than right here in the good old USA.
Well, the president's also been signing executive orders aiming to limit US assistance overseas and to reverse Biden-era foreign policy. On Friday, the State Department issued a halt to existing and new foreign aid. The notice appears to affect everything from development assistance to military support, with exceptions only for emergency food aid and military funding for Israel and Egypt. This could affect material support to Ukraine, which received billions of dollars in US military aid and weapons under the previous Biden administration. I got Ravi Agrawal's reaction to this week's developments. He's editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine and the host of FP Live. Ravi, you'll have seen reports that there's going to be a thorough review of the aid that America sends abroad. What's your reaction to that?
Well, this could have devastating implications for many countries around the world for a number of massive crises. There are several non-government organizations that rely on aid from the United States distributed by the State Department. There's also America's own aid agency, USAID, that gets a lot of funding from the State Department, which is then deployed around the world in a range of crises to try and help people in need. The sort of very mundane but necessary work of getting food to people who need food, getting other types of aid and medical supplies in a range of crisis situations around the world. All of that could be jeopardized. And a lot of these NGOs, they do long-term planning. They rely on the stability of the annual funding that they get from the United States. If you take that out of the equation, all of a sudden, all of them have massive holes to fill. And teams that they will be unable to support.
But while you're disappointed by the news, given that Donald Trump and his allies were elected on an America First platform, this shouldn't necessarily come as a surprise.
No, it shouldn't come as a surprise. And I think aid agencies have been worried about this for quite a while. They've been warning about it for quite a while. But even so, if it happens as we expect it to, it will be a shock. The America First agenda, part of it, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, when he went to the State Department this week to speak to his team, his new team, he made very clear that America's foreign policy with him at the helm is going to focus exclusively on American national interests and not on the interests of other countries, of other priorities. And they will claw back anything they can claw back, a much more transactional form of foreign policy, which will, be something that bigger countries might be able to exploit if they're able to find give and take touch points where they can take advantage, but much harder for smaller countries to play that game.
Now, you've just been at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and I'm guessing that Donald Trump dominated quite a few of the discussions there.
He really did. So he wasn't there. But he cast a very long shadow over proceedings. Every single leader I spoke to, obviously in Europe, but also other parts of the world, were very concerned about what his tariffs would mean for them, what his other threats would mean for them. For example, his claim that he could invade Greenland, certainly something that has worried a lot of European officials. His threats of tariffs on Canada and Mexico, of course, would have devastating impacts on the economies there. So these were all things that came up again and again in every single conversation that even had nothing to do with America, but Trump would come up again and again.
But I wonder if while you heard concern from political leaders, amongst business leaders, there may have been optimism at a lower regulation approach in America.
Oh, absolutely. I think most CEOs are quite pleased. They see lowered taxes, deregulation, a more business-friendly climate. Also, Trump has made very clear that he's going to get rid of diversity initiatives, DEI as it's known, ESG, so environmental regulations, a lot of that stuff that I think some companies had become a bit tired of, now they can do away with those. So there's a lot of optimism among CEOs. Stock markets have been soaring in the past week or so on that. But again, all of this comes with a degree of flux and uncertainty. Trump sees his unpredictability, what he often sees as and has called the madman theory that was coined by President Nixon, as somewhat of an advantage for him. But that puts everyone else at a disadvantage. And more than that, it also calls into question the rules and norms that the United States has backstopped for well over 75 years since the end of the Second World War. All of that comes into question and creates, jungle law essentially around the world.
Can I finally ask you about the war in Ukraine? There's been a lot of expectation of how Donald Trump would approach that conflict once he was in power. We've been listening to him on the subject now for 4 or 5 days. What have you made of his statements?
Well, he had promised that on day one, he would solve the problem. He would ensure that the war would come to a stop. That hasn't happened, of course. But part of it is because in recent days, he has walked back a lot of his claims, and in fact, has been walked back a lot of his claims, and in fact, has been much tougher on Russia than many of us had expected. And some European leaders are actually quite pleased that at his speech, his virtual talk at the World Economic Forum, he said that he wanted to dramatically lower oil prices, primarily to punish Russia, to choke off the flow of money that goes to Moscow and force it to be in a position where it would have to come to the negotiating table. We've known for quite a while that at some point the war would end at the negotiating table. What happens, though, is it depends on which country is in a position of strength. And if Trump uses his threats and unpredictability to weaken Russia, to force it to come to the table with less strength than one had imagined before, then that could be an outcome that is actually good for Ukraine, and a surprising one given everything he had said on the campaign trail.
Thanks to Ravi Agrawal. Now, the first executive order that President Trump signed on Monday night pardoned more than 1,500 defendants involved in the January the 6th riot at the US Capitol 4 years ago. He also commuted the prison term of Enrique Tarrio, the former leader of the far-right Proud Boys, who was sentenced to 22 years for seditious conspiracy, as well as the founder of Oath Keepers, Stuart Rhodes, who was imprisoned for 18 years. President Trump has described the punishments as ridiculous and excessive. A policeman who was on duty during the riot has described the pardons as a slap in the face. Well, joining me live is Democratic strategist and former mayor of Baltimore, Stephanie Rawlings-Blake, and Republican strategist and senior partner at Penta, Kevin Madden. Both of you, you're very welcome here on the BBC. Kevin, what was your reaction on Monday when you heard about those pardons?
Well, I think it was it's obviously a very difficult issue. It's one that inflames a lot of passions on both sides of the topic. I think for those of us who have worked in the Capitol and those of us who have worked in the institution of Congress, January 6th was a very dark day. Since January 6th, there have been a lot of very deeply held partisan opinions that have shaped a lot of the political battles around this. But I think there is a major gap between the view of partisans and those inside Washington and many of the voters that are sort of outside of Washington who are looking for the country to move on from that debate. I think Trump's bet with these pardons was twofold. First is that there are a lot of Americans who prefer that this no longer becomes a topic of conversation, it no longer becomes a political debate. And then I think his second bet is that Joe Biden's long list of controversial pardons and controversial commutations will essentially cancel out some of the negative politics that Trump will face based on his decision. And I think that's kind of where we are right now, is essentially a negated politics of this.
Stephanie Rawlings-Blake, what about you?
Well, I don't think it's a difficult issue at all. It was a dark day because we saw vigilantes descend on the Capitol and actually have a Confederate flag for the first time running through the halls of the Capitol. It was a disgrace that we all saw. The individuals who were serving sentences did so because they went through the legal process. Many of them had jurors of their peers and were found guilty. So to suggest that this is, akin to any pardon that former President Biden did is really just silly, and it is not an accurate depiction of what we saw with our own eyes. We have to think about, what do we value as Americans? And you can't say that you value the rule of law, number one, and have a felon as the president of the United States. And number two, to have someone use it on day one, his pardon power, to pardon individuals who ravaged the Capitol, that tried to upend our democracy, that injured and ended up with the death of police officers. So, I think this is unfortunately not going to end the debate, because I think a lot of police officers, particularly those in the FOPs around the country that thought that they had a friend in Donald Trump, now have to face a harsh reality that he doesn't have their back. And he's really, with the Supreme Court really expanding the immunity of the president, coupled with these pardons, I think the president has really just created his own militia that he is empowered to do his bidding around the country. Well, that know that if they do what they do in the name of Donald Trump, they don't have to worry about it, because
of course the president would push back at any idea that this was a creation of his own militia. But it will be interesting to see. Clearly, this week it has not closed down any discussions about January the 6th. We'll have to see how those pardons are considered and discussed as we go through the coming weeks, months and years of the Trump administration. Stephanie and Kevin, stay with us. Another issue that the Trump administration has turned to in its first few days is deporting migrants from the US. State Department officials confirmed that 2 military planes flew about 80 people each back to Guatemala. Hours after taking office, President Trump had declared an emergency at the US-Mexico border and signed a set of executive orders aimed at cracking down on immigration. He announced that 1,500 active duty troops would be sent to the border, and all refugee processing and travel has been halted, including travel for refugees already cleared to come to the US. And he signed an order to end automatic birthright citizenship in the US, though a judge has temporarily blocked that, calling the order blatantly unconstitutional. Donald Trump says he will appeal that ruling. Stephanie, if I could come back to you first, do you agree that taking action on the issue of immigration is in line with what the majority of Americans want?
I think the majority of Americans want there to be a humane and secure border. And if President Trump would have supported the bipartisan immigration law under the previous administration, I think we'd be a lot further along. What the Trump administration is known for is show, not necessarily getting the job done. And sending 80 migrants back to Guatemala, the expense, the federal expense that is done, I don't think it's a good use. I would love to hear what Elon Musk and his Doge committee think about that as a effective use of federal funds, when in reality, if President Trump would have just, taken the time to talk to the GOP-controlled Congress and pass that bipartisan bill, I think it would have been a much better step towards actually effectively securing our borders.
And Kevin, what do you make of this decision around refugees? All refugee processing and travel halted, including travel for refugees already cleared to come to the US. Do you agree with that?
Well, I agree that we should have a much more modernized immigration system, and we need to do a better job of bringing people into the country in a way that is humane and consistent with the aspirations and goals that we have for the country. I'm a son of immigrants, so I think this is particularly important to me. The country, I'm a son of immigrants, so I think this is particularly important to me. I think what's important is to sort of just figure out and analyze the political wind that Donald Trump believes he has at his back and why he's taking such decisive action and such sweeping action. And it really is the fact that if there's one thing this president believes, it's that he has a huge mandate, that was given to him by the voters in November to take sweeping action on securing the border and ensuring that we enforce the existing immigration policies that we have. And so I think that is where...
Just to jump in there, Kevin, and to emphasize that one of the issues here for the Trump administration is not just the policies it announces, but how they're implemented, as you allude to.
Yeah, so that was my next point, which is that I think in concept, the president does have broad support. If you looked at the election in 2024, immigration reform and border security rose to the top of a lot of voters' agenda because of the way they saw lax enforcement and lax border security at the southern
Kevin,
border.
let me just jump in here.
As a concept, it is something that has broad support. The risk is that, and as we see this, as this will start to be part of the implementation, is that the risk is that can be very messy in reality.
Well, I'm going to jump in here, Kevin. I'm going to jump in here, and very quickly, Stephanie, I have only a few seconds. How should the Democrats approach this in 20, 30 seconds?
The Democrats should stand up against the GOP and these policies that are against the values of our country. We have to stand up and be the moral compass for this country, because what is happening is not done in our name.
Both of you, I'm going to jump in because we're right up against the end of the programme. As we're seeing, there's an awful lot to discuss. I'm sure we'll continue that discussion on BBC News. Thank you very much indeed to Stephanie Rawlings-Blake and to Kevin Madden. There is more on all of these subjects on the BBC News website. But for me, for the moment, bye-bye.
Storm Iowyn's been bringing some extreme disruption to northern areas of the UK in terms of widespread power supply problems and widespread transport disruption to a number of trees blown over by the strong winds. And talking about the winds, they peaked at 114 miles an hour at Mace Head in the Republic of Ireland, which was the Republic of Ireland's strongest wind gust on record. The previous record set in 1945. And after this measurement was made at 5 in the morning, Friday morning, it went offline. We don't know what happened to it. Maybe it got damaged in the winds. Meanwhile, in Killowen, the 92-mile-an-hour gust we had here was Northern Ireland's strongest gust for over a quarter of a century. This is where Iowyn is at the moment, drifting slowly northeastward, slowly filling, slowly becoming a little bit less powerful. But still for northern Scotland, we have an amber warning that's valid until 6 in the morning Saturday. Still with winds strong enough to blow down a few trees, so further blustery conditions here. We do have a band of squally rain pushing eastwards across England at the moment, and there are lots of showers for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Some of these coming through as sleet, a little bit of snow up over some of the highest hills as well. So that's the setup as we head into Saturday. Now, across the Hebrides, it'll still be blowing a gale here for Saturday morning. Very strong winds for Orkney, slightly less strong in the far north in Shetland. Still plenty of showers around for Scotland. Otherwise, many areas having a dry morning with some sunshine. We do then have this band of heavy rain that works into Northern Ireland through Saturday afternoon. Some of that's going to be quite heavy, quite intense for a short spell of time, and accompanied by some gusty winds too. That will move eastwards through Saturday night. But into Sunday, we've got another area of low pressure on the cards, another named storm. This one has been named as Storm Armenia, which has been named by the Spanish authorities. Strong winds extend up through the Irish Sea, gusts of 60 to 70 miles an hour. OK, it's not on the same scale as Storm Iowyn. It won't cause the same kind of damage and disruption, but it is going to be a windy day with some severe gales around and a band of heavy rain. This time it's the north of Scotland that will have the driest and the brightest of the weather conditions. Once that lot has eased through into the early part of next week, the weather is going to stay unsettled with heavy rain at times. It will stay on the windy side as well.
Morning. Come and have a seat. Now, of course, I'm not going to go easy on you. There are some really big questions we've got to try and get answers to this morning. But I'll be fair, and we just want to hear what you've got to say. So, shall we get on with it?
We're rolling.
Here we go. Join me to hear from the biggest names inside and outside politics.
Sunday with Laura Koonsberg, tomorrow at 9 on BBC One and iPlayer.
Witness the magic when experience meets raw talent.
There has to be a moment where I can say, wow, this is beautiful.
I love that.
Renowned icons with emerging artists on a unique learning journey.
If you do it with conviction.
So take that further.
From mentor to protege.
Everything what I tell her, she's doing right away. We're gonna have some fun.
Watch a legacy unfold.
They really are here to help us.
Bravo! Arts in Motion. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
This is BBC News. We'll have the headlines for you at the top of the hour, which is straight after this programme.
The way we work has changed forever.
The impact of work from home post-pandemic is probably the biggest change to hit society since maybe World War II.